Hi there, welcome to my talk on authorization. My name is Simon Moffatt. I'm founder and analyst at the Cyber Hut, and it's an honor and a privilege today to be talking at the IAM Tech Day. Um, Authorization has been a huge passion of mine over the last 20 years or so, as I've been observing trends and emerging patterns within the identity and access management space. And I wanted to have a little sort of 10-minute segue into this emerging area of authorization. Why is it important now? And possibly take a little bit of a look into what may be happening in the future. So, first thing I want to really start by setting the scene of the basics, really, setting us back in time a little bit, grounding ourselves in the difference really between authentication and authorization. And both of these things are often highly interchanged. They get used synonymously to describe the sort of verification and validation of identities and of access rights. But they are very subtly different. And I think in 2022, they're becoming even more different, even more polarized in the application of both authentication and authorization technology. And authentication is something we are all very familiar with. We log into our desktops on a Monday morning. We log into web applications. We log into our mobile banking. We're very familiar with how the authentication process works, but there are a few interesting subtleties here. On the left hand side, we have something to trigger or start the authentication process, typically a login event, but that could also be in relation to things like step up authentication or step up validation verification events, which may well be being triggered by a high risk transaction, a high risk event, possibly maybe moving a large sum of money around, perhaps, or maybe logging into a privileged account within the workforce ecosystem. And there's a couple of other, I guess, prerequisites or triggers which often occur uh, sort of prior to the authentication process, which is things like registration. An identity has to be created. There might well be some identity proofing, which may well have happened or may happen in conjunction to the authentication trigger. So we have something happening on this left hand side, and we have this black box or gray box of authentication services. And then the output of that is typically a couple of things. One is some sort of assurance level. The NIST identity standards often talk about the authentication assurance level, the AAL, but we're really talking about some sort of transient number or value which can be assigned to this validated and verified identity. Simon may have a level 3 level of assurance, which may indicate quite a low level of assurance, for example. And the other interesting aspect with this output of authentication is session. The session in this sort of example is really referring to time. So my assurance level has a very set period of time, maybe an hour, maybe a minute, maybe a couple of hours, for example. But the authentication verification process typically has a finite lifespan. And clearly, the further away we are from the authentication event, the lower the level of assurance, and the longer the session, the lower level of assurance associated with it. So something happens on the left hand side. We have this stuff on the right hand side, this assurance level, which is typically time based. And then this grey box. And the grey box is this very interesting concept called authentication, which is a specialist event. You're verifying maybe a credential, could be a username, a password, a shared secret, maybe a passwordless credential, maybe a certificate or some sort of cryptographic key which is being issued. And we're also starting to see the introduction of other pieces of contextual information, device information, location information, information around the history of myself, where I've been, what I've done, previous transactions against the system I'm trying to access, as well as things like threat intelligence data and information as well. Maybe information around my maybe breached credentials, for example, or perhaps threat intelligence around the make and model of my mobile device that I'm authenticating from. So we have this authentication box, we have a lot of information being placed in there. And the output of that as I go through this process is essentially an assurance level and a time-based relationship, be it a cookie, a token, or a session. Now, that feeds quite nicely into authorization, subtly very different. So this little grey box also takes something from the left-hand side, which is typically that assurance level, some sort of validated or proofed piece of identity information, an identity token, a cookie, an assertion, a federation cookie or a token, for example, as well. So that's basically allowing me as an identity to present myself to an authorization function, something which is essentially going to decide whether I should have access to something. It's an access decision. That could be as mundane as opening a file. It could well be something like making a purchase online, or perhaps accessing my online banking. There is an object I want access to, a subject which is being presented, and a set of actions which things I want to do against that object, complete the transaction, or complete a particular event, for example. So the authorization grey box in this case is again going to have some inputs. It's got our authentication event, our identity event, and then again it's going to have some extra information, permissions, who can have access to these objects and what can they do. So this is typically the permissions or entitlements list, access control list essentially, which is linking the subject and the objects together, all wrapped around some actions in there as well, like read and write, or allow, deny, etc., etc. We're also going to have some context in there as well, maybe device context, maybe context around the particular event or transaction that I'm wishing to complete. And all of that essentially goes into a decision engine, which will contain rules, policies, and other pieces of static information to essentially come to an access control decision. Can this person gain access to this particular object under certain conditions? So I just wanted to set the scene there for a couple of minutes as to what authorization is and this really subtle difference between authentication that we've often seen emerge in the last year or two. And the big question really comes up is, does security really start when the authentication event has ended? Now, there's a lot of investment and there's a lot of technology in the authentication space currently. Multi-factor authentication with security keys, biometrics, specialist biometric providers, passwordless authentication has had a huge boom in the last sort of 2 to 3 years, and numerous different vendors delivering WebAuthn and FIDO2 based passwordless authentication. But in honesty, does security really start once that process has finished? Providing access into downstream systems, maybe powered by the likes of zero trust and identity centric security, maybe being powered by the likes of PII protection, the protection of personal identifiable information in the consumer space, protection of APIs in general, or the protection of data in there as well. So does security really start once the person has logged into the system? I think we're starting to see the answer is yes to that. I think it is the technology and the demand for access control functionality is now maturing. I think the question really is actually authentication, certainly MFA and strong MFA, is a table stakes within the security architecture. Access control and authorization really is where the main security landscape is starting to differentiate. So a question is, as an industry analyst, why now? Why is this stuff interesting to today? Why is authorization suddenly becoming more in demand, and the funding into authorization is increasing substantially? And why is this happening today? And there's a couple of things to think about. I think number one is we've always had quite a strong historical approach to authorization. It's not a new concept. Access control, authorization, the protection of objects has been around really since commercial computing. And there's been a few standards and a few approaches to this, things like role-based access control, things like attribute-based access control, which is still very popular today. A couple of other standards which have been around for a while, XACML, the XML-based extensible access control markup language, really was the first approach to breaking down authorization into the various different components of policy decision points, which contained logic, enforcement points, which were essentially the sort of gateways and the interceptors to protect downstream assets, And that was a very strong foundation to understanding authorization, which was very big. It was very leveraging technologies like XML, which are no longer that popular in the developers toolkit. So we've had some concepts and some theory there. And I think since then, we've started to see an emergence of newer technologies, a thing called Zanzibar, which came out of Google Research, this emphasis around declarative controls, so having a declared set of rules and policies in there as well, which is quite interesting. And I think if we start to look at some of the sort of driving trends as to why authorization is suddenly becoming more interesting. The last 3.5 years, we've suddenly seen over $150 million in funding being plowed into fixing some of these access control and authorization technologies. I think we're starting to see an emergence of different types of authorization vendors, be that the external authorization platforms, whether it could be the declarative sort of rule and logic based decision making tools like the Open Policy Agent, which has been around for quite a while, and open source projects there, or things like the access request process. So companies like Indent and Conductor One, others who are looking to try and manage the relationship between the user and those downstream systems as well. But those meta trends really around homegrown authorization is really starting to become a limiter to business growth. So what does that mean? Well, essentially, organizations are starting to see the impact of bad access control. Homegrown systems, which are very static, embedded groups and permissions within applications themselves, very, very difficult to update, very, very difficult to change. And that's really becoming an issue around not only evolving security threats, but competitive threats as well. Things like the protection of PII now is really being seen as a competitive differentiator or competitive advantage. And homegrown systems essentially do not allow this fine-grained ability to protect PII and consumer data in a way which is scalable and extensible. This has then driven really the industry to look at some interesting modern capabilities for authorization. I think in the past, we've had homegrown solutions which were very siloed. They were very much bespoke and customized to particular web applications or web portals, or maybe structured SQL database style protection mechanisms. And suddenly today, we're looking at a much broader ecosystem of assets that need to be protected. We're talking about the protection of infrastructure services, things like maybe Kubernetes or containerized infrastructure. We're talking about the protection of APIs. We're talking about the protection of data. We're talking about the protection of mobile applications, single page applications. The number of assets needing protection, needing access control and permissions logic is becoming a lot larger. And again, moving from this paradigm from being scared and sharing less data and being very protective to really being in a data driven economy where organizations need to share more to more people. And those people aren't always within the organization. They could be partners, they could be part of a federated ecosystem, they could be consumers and customers external to the organization. So we're going to share more ecosystem. And we're looking to move away from things being hard coded and static to being more policy driven. So policy which would contain rules, it could have a version control associated with it, it could contain context, and it allows organizations to have a repeatable and reusable set of authorization components which they can essentially apply to this new range of different assets which they need to protect. And those assets will not always on premises. They're going to be cloud components, they could be SaaS components. You may well be wanting to protect things in Amazon ecosystems or Google ecosystems as well. And broad, flexible enforcement is going to be a very, very vital part as to how a modern authorization system is going to be deployed and how successful that will be. And these modern capabilities really cannot be delivered by homegrown systems, which hence we are starting to see this demand for commercial platforms, external decision engines, and the sort of productionization, if you like, of some of this access control functionality. But what next? As analysts, we get asked quite a lot around, trying to predict the future. What's the next big trend? What's going to happen? Which technology should we invest in or should procure? It's very difficult, of course, to try and predict the future. But there are some interesting sort of inputs or data signals that we leverage to try and do. Is we look at funding patterns. We're looking at the use cases being solved. We look at the technology that is evolving and mergers and acquisitions, and et cetera, et cetera. And there are one or two meta trends that we've started to see. And like most predictions looking into the future, they should be taken with a little bit of sort of sensible reasoning there. But there are some interesting things to think about over the next maybe 3 years when looking at authorization. We're certainly seeing this trend to migrate away from homegrown solutions. Embedded access control, very, very hard coded, very bespoke and specific to a particular API or web system. Organizations are migrating away from those systems onto commercial access control and sort of decoupled access control platforms. We're definitely seeing the demand for rules and policy-based tooling. Things like Open Policy Agent and the one or two other sort of competitors to that, which allow the externalization of permissions logic into rules, which can be version controlled, they can be created programmatically, they can be stored in different systems. And that productionization really is allowing organizations to look for the next 18 months or so, having these reusable components every time they release an API, every time they release a mobile app, pull down some sort of off-the-shelf access control logic, which is version controlled and has governance wrapped around it, which can be integrated into things like application lifecycle and DevOps life cycles. Very, very important. And I think moving a little bit further ahead, the next 24 to 36 months, definitely see more demand around the protection of data objects. Yes, microservices, yes, APIs, but the underlying asset that is being protected in those landscapes is data. It's pieces of data, maybe JSON objects, maybe pieces of structured and unstructured data stored in data lakes, SQL, NoSQL, document-based systems in there as well. And moving again towards this concept of just-in-time and runtime access control. So sort of moving away from having hard-coded static permissions. Simon has access to these groups or these permissions, and it's always the case. Doing something much more runtime based on context. Simon can only gain access to this document if he passes certain contextual checks, like he's on a known network and a known device, and his risk and threat intelligence signals are under a particular threshold, for example. And then clearly from a maturity perspective, moving to this concept of being optimized, which is clearly leveraging reusable components, leveraging the ability to deploy at speed and look to iterate and continually improve the access control ecosystem. So we're certainly seeing the beginning of this journey. I think clearly some of the milestones may well be a little bit different in their exact position on the timeline, but we're definitely starting this journey. We have the tooling and the technology in the marketplace. Organizations are looking to migrate. We receive numerous inquiries weekly really around how organizations can migrate and understand the technology in the landscape to migrate on this journey, really to leverage access control as a business enabler. So it's exciting journey. I think access control has been around for a long time. It's certainly now, I think, more important than it ever has been in the last 15, 20 years of identity and access management. And we're certainly seeing that the start of this journey, which I think is quite an exciting one. That was the end of my quick lightning talk. Authorization is a huge, broad, sprawling topic. It's certainly one which we've been tracking a lot at the Cyberhut over the last sort of 12 months or so. Lots of exciting vendors in this space, lots of funding, Series A and B and C funding happening in this space. Organizations really are now seeing access control as a key business enabler. It isn't just a security component, which it obviously is, but getting access control right is allowing organizations to share more data to more people, engage in collaborative relationships, protect PII and consumer data and information at scale and at speed, and be a privacy enabling organization. I think it's a really exciting time to start looking into authorization, looking into how authorization can affect your business, essentially. That's the end of my talk. Reach out directly at the Cyberhut website, or via email, or on Twitter. We'd love to hear all of your stories and engagement around access control and authorization in general. But thank you for listening. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.